Thank you, Callie. Let me just move this so you can hear me. So yes, this is the title of my talk today. I should say it's a now newly professor. I got a little bit of a promotion. So the title today is Brazen Women Challenging Gender Expectations in a Time of War and Chaos. And so what I'm going to talk about today is the woman's story about what happens during the Texas Revolution. And it's my talk or my material for today's discussion, okay, not working, there we go, is from my book, which she just showed you. I didn't know she was going to show you. So this is a copy of my book that came out last year on some of the material from today's talk. Okay, so we begin our story with the runaway scrape, which is part of the title of my book. And the runaway scrape is relevant to the civilian side of the Texas Revolution. It happens at a particular time during the Texas Revolution, and it affects, everybody else who was in the state during this time period. And the term actual runaway scrape is from the period. It is first used during the period and then in subsequent reminiscences that are published later. So it's the terminology of the day. And basically what has happened, the revolution starts quite well for the Texian forces in the fall of 1835. But that's all until, the Mexican forces show up, which happens. You start to see people leaving homesteads in January, as early as January. But the peak period of the runaway scrape is March and April of 1836. And basically what is happening is that people who have been left behind on the farms and plantations in Texas, and we're talking about obviously women and children, men that are too old to fight, perhaps disabled or what have you, and enslaved people. So they are the ones who are left behind. And initially, they send the men off to war and they are living there. But unfortunately, they are in the line of fire of the Mexican forces that are coming through the settlements. And so at a certain point, things start to look particularly dire, okay, where the Mexican forces are advancing through the settlements. And I'm going to talk about where Sam Houston was during this time period, but basically he's going to be on the Colorado River making a pretty significant decision here about what the Texian forces are going to do. But upon hearing at the Colorado River, this is around circa March 20th to March 27th, he makes the decision to retreat. His forces are going to fall back. And so, for those that are on the in the front lines of this, if the Texian forces are falling back, what are they supposed to think? This looks pretty bad. And Houston had heard. By this point we'd had the fall of the Alamo, so that was obviously a terrible event, a rallying event to be sure, but a terrible event in terms of it's a significant loss. And Houston hears about what happens at Goliad by the time he makes his decision. Now, there's a little more to his decision because he wants to have more time to train his troops. He knows that most of these, they're not professionals. So they have to have time to prepare for the ultimate fight. And so he makes a decision to fall back at the Colorado River. There are others at the time that had made this, were telling him to fight, and he has even written during this time period that he planned to fight. But circumstances are what they are, and he makes a pivot, and he falls back with his forces to fight another day. And so at this point, you basically have the civilians panicking, okay? There's no other way of saying it. People leave their farms and homesteads to the extent that you even have people who've left meals on the table. That's how fast they're running. They're absolutely panicked that they are going to be overrun. And so the retreat is essentially to the Louisiana border, okay, to the Sabine. It is, you got to get out of the way of the the onslaught of the Mexican forces. And so that's what the runaway scrape is. The runaway scrape is the civilian retreat. In addition, that happens and coincides with the Texian forces, okay? And so families are running for their lives. Okay, so before I can talk about this issue of brazen women, I want to talk about what expectations were for women. And, I'm going to be sort of speaking in generalities here, but I want to kind of go to the ideal that is sort of presented during this time period, 1830s to 1840s, when it came to women's roles. What were women's roles? And in some ways, it's interesting to sort of look at this with an eye towards not all women lived up anywhere near to these roles during this time period. So it's an ideal, it's not reality for a lot of women, particularly women on a frontier. So I've got an image here from Godey's Ladies Book. And what this is it's a very popular magazine during the mid-19th century. The publisher of it, you can see his name down there, Louis Godey, was a man. The editor of Godey's Ladies Book is a woman. And she takes up her role as editor in 1837 and serves that role for 4 decades. So, Godey's Ladies Book is very much associated with this woman, Sarah Josepha Hale. And Sarah Josepha Hale was a mother had many children. Her husband died and she had to sort of get a job and support the family. So she becomes editor of this very popular women's magazine during this time period. Interestingly, sidebar, she's known for writing the poem Mary Had a Little Lamb. So that's, sorry about that. So she, but her principal occupation was being editor of this ladies' book. And why am I telling you about this? This kind of magazine, this kind of publication in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century, she very much is sort of part of a larger movement, which is this celebration of what I'd call domestic ideology. The idea that the place for a woman was in the home. That, her role was to, raise her family, create a home that's comfortable for her family. That's the idea. And, from the last presentation, for those that were here, you saw that a lot of people had just come to Texas, after 1830. So when we're talking about homes, we're talking about, brand new homes. A lot of people do not have sophisticated structures. They're living in log cabins. They're living in very, rustic abodes. And so, but they had a lot of pride in their home. They had it was important to them to set up a home that was safe for their families. And so you see that kind of idea sort of pushed in this prescriptive literature. And that's what it was called, prescriptive literature. And that word meaning, it's sort of, it's telling people, it's instructions on how to live. This is the purview of women. This is what women were expected to do, was to raise a home and a family. And homes were seen as a sanctuary. Homes were seen as the safe space for the family. And we're talking about, in 1830s Texas, it's pretty dangerous. There are a lot of Indian attacks that you have to sort of face. There's a lot of, bugs, I'm guessing, just, so there's a lot of things that, that when you're living in a very rustic structure, you can sort of imagine that, having those walls and having a sanctuary. So what happens when an invading army is threatening that sanctuary? The fear and the trauma of the moment of trying to get out of the way, out of an invading army. That's sort of what you're dealing with when you're talking about the runaway scrape. So this prescriptive literature. Now, one of the things that you see talked about in this kind of literature is this notion of true womanhood. And again, ideal, okay, not reality, is that women were by nature more pious, more pure, more submissive, and naturally domestic, okay? And I'm gonna talk about some women that were none of these things, okay? That's why they were brazen, okay? They weren't submissive. They challenged, men in different capacities. And they did so because of the chaos. They did so because their lives had been thrown upside down. And they had to sort of respond accordingly. And I'm going to make the kind of case at the end that, maybe, whatever brazenness they brought to the table during the conflict, during the chaos, when things settled down, they were expected to fall back into their roles. Okay, so this is just sort of a flash, a moment of chaos and maybe possible change. But that's what I'm talking about with regards to the brazenness of the women. Okay, so I've got some examples of the literature during this time period, and I've even got examples of, a woman from Texas. So we'll, actually hone in on somebody, although she wrote it much later after the fact. So this is published in 1834, and it sort of talks about the women's sphere, where she was naturally supposed to be, which is the home, the domestic sphere. And it's entrusted to our sex. And so, making a proper home and making a home, a household for your family, that's what you should take pride in. That's what's important during this time period. That's what they're writing about and talking about. And I think what's interesting about someone like Sarah Josepha Hale is that she's writing, she's counseling, she publishes works with other women that are sort of talking about this is the right way for you to, move forward. This is the way you should, establish your life. But she herself actually stepped out of the domestic sphere. If you think about it, she has a job. She is not just staying in the home. So in some ways, even the role that she's taken on, which she had to do out of necessity, she herself is not actually practicing what she preaches entirely, right? So there's this sort of, on the one hand, there's this ideal that you're supposed to live, and then there's the reality that other women don't live this ideal. They make decisions in their households. They're not submissive. Not all women are submissive. It's not a thing now. It wasn't a thing then. Okay, so that's sort of the thing to keep in mind. So this is just the kind of thing you would see. So this is Mary Sherwood Whiteman Hellman. I'm going to talk a little. She's going to be the first person I sort of talk about today, of the various women I'm going to talk about today. And this is something that she wrote where she's talking about the sacred precinct, the home as being the sacred precinct. Okay, here, by her ostentatiousness and hallowed influence. I mean, you see also the religious sort of dynamic. In Godey's Lady's book, you often see women writing about their spirituality, their religion, their what is in their hearts. And so this is actually published in 1884. She published her life in Texas. This is part of her memoirs that's published well after the fact. She was part of the runaway scrape. So decades after the fact, she writes, and I'm going to say a little bit about memoirs and their relevance and what we should think about them. But so she's writing about it. In Scraps of Early Texas, she talks about her experiences in early Texas. She talks about her experiences during the runaway scrape. And she also talks about her religion and sort of how people sort of fell short of the mark as far as she was concerned. She had a lot of ideas. It's part her values that are in there as well as her sort of memoirs. But she's part of this prescriptive literature of the time. Okay. So brazenness, let's go back to brazenness. Let's talk about some brazen women. So this is an image actually of Rosalie Bridget Hart Pryor. And her family were Irish. She, just in terms of their, when they came or when she was born on August 1st, 1825. She was only 11 at the time of the runaway scrape. So the story that she sort of tells of brazenness is actually her mother's story, how her mother was a brazen woman during this time period. Her parents came to Texas in 1834. They were part of an Irish group that came to the Power and Hewitson colony. They had attracted, hundreds of immigrants to come over. So her family comes over, they land on the Texas shores, and the first day they arrive, her father dies of cholera. Tragic story, didn't mean to bring it down, but it's not a happy day in some ways. So her mother is a widow. She's got two surviving daughters to this new place that she's moved to, which is, I've just explained to you, is quite dangerous. And we know there's going to be a war brewing soon, so, danger still to come. And so she tells the story about what happens with her mom. So her father's name was Tom Hart, he died. Her mom remarries a man named John James. And John James had been married before and his wife had died. He had young children. He had a son, two sons that were age 5 and 3, and he had an illegitimate son who was a teenager. But focusing on the 2 little sons, so you've got Rosalie, her sister, and these 2 little boys. This is a family that's come together. And, chaos is sort of ensuing. Once we have the runaway scrape break out, she's got their family has to move. Elizabeth, her mom, moves her family. Meanwhile, John James, her husband, is focusing on his duties, on his responsibility. He's actually the city attorney for Refugio, that he's focusing on his administrative duties. But his youngest son gets sick, and he's allowed to leave his administrative duties to go and check on his family. The family had moved to Victoria, Texas. That was their sort of initial step. And then he catches up with the family and basically is going to tell his family what he thinks they should do. Now, when her father died, Tom Hart, on his deathbed, he had his wife promise to him that she would keep my children from bad company. That was the promise that was made to him as he was dying. And so, we have this crisis during the runaway scrape. John James comes to, deal with his family. And Elizabeth Hart thinks back to what her husband had made her promise. And what he wanted to do is he wanted to move the family to Labadee. Which is La Bahia, the Goliad site. And, Labadee is what the Irish call the site. And so he thought that they would be better off there if they moved to that site. But Elizabeth thought, you know what, I think that's where the Mexicans are going. She was kind of concerned that that's the route that the Mexicans are going. And she was thinking, if we go there, we are going to be in trouble. And she's like, no, I don't think I'm going to go there. I made a promise to keep my children safe, and I can't go there. And so she stands up to her husband. And her husband has said, and it's, such an issue, he takes his sons, okay? And the family separates. She takes her daughters. Ultimately, she's going to, board a schooner that was initially headed for New Orleans that's going to actually get rerouted because of the Mexican threat to Mobile, Alabama. So her and her daughters are going to live. I'm going to give you a quote here in just a second. He takes his sons to stay with Nicholas Fagan. And then he is going to go and look after the Ayuntamiento's archives. He's focused on his job again. He gets caught by the Mexicans, okay? He gets put with Fanning's men. And that's not a good place to be put because he gets killed with Fanning's men at the Goliad massacre. So John James dies, okay? And so this is a pretty important decision, I guess we can say. So in her memoirs, Rosalie wrote that when we were informed of Fanning's massacre, Mother wanted to go back to the San Antonio River to get my 2 stepbrothers, but the officials wouldn't listen to her. Elizabeth Hart returned to Texas in 1839, searching for the boys, but was unsuccessful. So, this is a woman standing up for her family, making a decision, standing up to the head of it. Is this submissive? Maybe not. So that's, sort of one example of a woman who had to make decisions for her family. I just have an image here of some of the settlements because I'm going to be referring to them, and if I'm going to be focusing on Matagorda here in just a second, but you can see all the various settlements, and we are going to end up at San Jacinto eventually, so we will get there. So again, I've already mentioned this again, but this whole when you're talking about brazenness, and when I get to you with some examples of brazen women, some of these brazen women are going to stand up to men that hold a whole lot of power. And one of the most powerful men during this moment is Sam Houston. So I'm going to tell you about a couple of women who stood up to Sam Houston during this time period. Again, kind of representing the brazenness at the moment. So there's debate amongst the Government officials about Houston's decision to retreat. There's criticism and there's infighting in his forces about some of the decisions that he's making, his strategy, if you will, during this time period, including by some of the civilian population, including by some of the women. And one of the women who sort of notedly criticized Sam Houston is this woman here, Mary Crownover Rabb. This is just a little excerpt of, she kept a diary, wrote about her experiences, I should say, reminiscences, based on her experiences in Texas. Just a little bit about her family. She was born in 1805. At the age of 16, she got married to a man named John Rabb in 1821. The family had 9 children. They came to Texas in 1823. So she writes about her experiences, travels, and adventures in Texas in the 1820s. It's pretty horrific. She gives you a real flavor of what it was like when her family moved here and how dangerous it was. They had settled. Their homestead was Rabb's Prairie. It was kind of present-day LaGrange, Colorado River. So they had settled. She's going to be a person that participates in the runaway scrape. So like all the other civilian population that are running for their lives, she, is part of the running for your life kind of thing. She had, talked about the rustic conditions. She had a spinning wheel. She, spinned, fabric for her family, made clothing for her family. And she said it was so scary, the conditions, that she at night would hear, she thought, Native Americans sort of, tribes outside, and she would just keep spinning and just pretend that she couldn't hear whatever was going on outside. So she really talks about the rustic sort of nature here. When she talked about Sam Houston's decision, she said, "Old Sam was afraid and would not fight." She criticized him. She was part of the number of people who, basically called Sam Houston yellow, and that he was just a coward and he wasn't willing to stand up to the Mexican forces. This is something that you see. She's, pretty brazen in going after, this obviously, the man of the hour that is going to be the hero of San Jacinto. She sacrificed a lot on the runaway scrape, including losing her baby. She had a little son named Lorenzo. And she talked about how little Lorenzo, not 3 months old, didn't make the journey, died along the trail. So it was, a brutal sort of retreat. The conditions were terrible. It was raining. It was unseasonably cold during the retreat. A lot of them, some of them had horses and oxen. Some had, were on foot or just were pulling carts and stuff. It was, depending on, where you at, you might not have had a lot. Okay, probably one of the most brazen women, well-known women during this time period is a woman named Pamela Mann. We know about her situation because a lot of soldiers wrote about her story. She has an encounter with Sam Houston that is, soldiers wrote about, that, historians have written about sort of after the fact. It became kind of, she's one of the few people we kind of know from the Texas Revolution. And so she was traveling runaway scrape, part of the runaway scrape, and she came across Houston's forces. She had 2 oxen. And one of the things that the military had to do in a fight is, sometimes they have to impress, meaning that they have to take your oxen if they need it, if they have to take whatever they need for the purposes of the soldiers. So they took her oxen, but she was kind of characterized as a notorious woman, so brazen and notorious. But she had basically got him to promise, like, I'll give you my oxen, but you have to go on this road. You have to go towards Nacogdoches. And he's like, yeah, sure, gonna go to Nacogdoches. Well, he goes a few miles along the road and then he turns on the Harrisburg Road and goes in a different direction. So he does not. So she ends up catching up with him. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of what happened. We had this is a soldier's account. We had a yoke of oxen pressed that belonged to a Mrs. Mann. She was said to be a notorious woman. The woman rode up to General Houston and said, "General, I've come for my oxen. I'm going to have them." Houston said, "Madame, don't irritate me." Apparently, Mrs. Mann was not amused. She responded, "Irritate the devil, I'm going to have my oxen." So Sparks, this is the soldier, said that she drew a pistol and pulled and pulled aside the team, went whoa, and then grabbed the team. There's different accounts. I've got another one here where it's even more spicy. She said, another soldier said, "General, you told me a damn lie. That you were going to the Nacogdoches Road, I want my oxen." So Houston, he said, no, obviously, couldn't spare them. And she said, "I don't care a damn for your cannon, I want my oxen." Equipped with 2 holster pistols and a very large knife, Mrs. Mann jumped down from her horse, turned around the oxen, and proceeded to cut the rawhide with her knife. Houston sends his wagon master after her. He comes back empty-handed, shirt torn, being mocked by everyone, and they were like, "What happened?" And she's like, "She tried to kill me." Sort of was, I'm paraphrasing, but it was something along those lines. And so is this really well-known episode that she's took. This is a receipt of her oxen that she gets back later on or whatever. So she's kind of a well-known woman, but just to kind of this is her written by her biographer, just a little bit about her. She was rough and crude and sometimes violent. To be sure, I kind of get the spiciness. Despite her masculinity, she had feminine charm and was attractive to men. She did not wait for the law or custom to emancipate her. She tore from herself the shackles of tradition. So she's kind of a notorious woman. I will say, and I'd sort of talk about this at more length than I will today, that she did not fare well in the years of the Republic. That same notoriousness, that same brazenness was looked down upon later on in life. And she, sort of faced a lot of kind of calamities, after this episode. So again, she's kind of well known for this episode. For a few years afterwards during the Republic, this is Pamela Mann was entangled in more litigation and was prosecuted for more different crimes than any man of her time. According to her, in a short span, she was the plaintiff in 7 civil cases and the defendant in 11. So she had a way. So one of the things I did want to tell you, an episode with her that happens, just to give you a sense of this. Once the Republic starts, Sam Houston, obviously president, he mandates the death penalty for anyone convicted of forgery. And she's going to be convicted of forgery during the period of the Republic. It involves a debt that she apparently had with a woman named Mrs. Mary Hardy. Mary Hardy loaned Pamela Mann $1,000. And when she went to collect, Pamela Mann pulled out a receipt and said, "Oh, this shows that I actually paid you." But the receipt was a forgery. And it was witnessed, interestingly, and dated, for those of you who can, it was witnessed by, apparently, William Barrett Travis. The date that it was witnessed was March 1st, 1836. What is going on March 1st, 1836? Well, Travis wasn't witnessing something at that point. He's obviously at the Alamo at that point. So she kind of got the date screwed up, and it was a forgery. She almost is charged. I mean, she's charged. There's a trial. The verdict is she's found guilty. The judge sort of says, and I mean, my eyesight's terrible here. She is on May 24th, after he says, the judge says, or on May 27th, this is supposed to be then and there between the hours of 12 and 2 o'clock on said day, she will be hanged by the neck till she is dead, and may the Lord have mercy on her soul. Now, she's convicted of a whole bunch of other crimes or whatever. She gets a pardon at the last minute, survives this moment. She's actually going to die in 1840. So despite all the kind of calamities and the cases that she's involved in, she does not live long past this time. But obviously a very interesting woman. But obviously also that kind of behavior may not have been something that was appreciated long after the fact. So there's just a little bit about her. These are the crimes that she ultimately faced during this time period. Her death is November 4th, 1840. So a whole lot. Fornication is obviously an interesting one, which we won't go into today, but she faces a lot during this time period. So, one last one that seems particularly relevant today is the case of Mrs. Margaret Peggy McCormick. She plays an interesting role. Just a little bit about her. She was born in around 1788. We think she moved to Texas. We don't have an exact date, but around 1823, 1824. Her husband ends up drowning. They settled south of Buffalo Bayou, at the junction of Buffalo Bayou and the San Jacinto River. And so the battle takes place on her land. Okay, and she's gone. She's part of the runaway scrape. She's left. She comes back to find a lot going on her land, and by a lot going on, I mean hundreds of dead bodies on her land. And she would not like that situation to remain. So she, finds her way to Houston. Settles up to Houston, and I want to get the quote here because it's again quite colorful. He's about 3 miles away. She rides up to him and she's like, "Can you clean up all the dead bodies that you've left on my land? The hundreds of bodies that are on my land." And they have a heated exchange. Again, brazenness, not submissive. And he says, "Madame," he's saying to her, Peggy McCormick, "your land will be famed in history as the classic spot upon which the glorious victory of San Jacinto was gained. Here was born, in the throes of revolution and amid the strife of contending legions, the infant of Texas independence. Here, the great scourge of mankind, the arrogant, self-styled Napoleon of the West, met his fate," obviously. And so she replies, "To the devil with your glorious history. Take off your stinking Mexicans." So she, basically again stands up to Sam Houston, says, "Clean up the mess that you've left." He does not. He does not clean up the mess. And actually, he, expected the Mexicans, the surviving Mexicans, to do it. They did not. So it was left to Peggy McCormick and her neighbors to ultimately deal with this. And it was, a disgusting, you can imagine, situation for some time kind of beyond that. So again, another brazen woman. And I will just say, I mentioned the issue of reminiscences. A lot of the sources that I ended up using for my work were written long after the fact. They were written decades after the fact. And obviously there's an issue of, maybe memory, how strong of a memory can a person have but this was a traumatic event. We have some, soldiers' accounts and first-hand accounts that wrote about it during what happened during the runaway scrape. But a lot of times it happened long after the fact. And so it's an interesting moment that, we may not see the Texas Revolution as a female event. We may not see their role in San Jacinto or anything that's sort of going on, but they obviously, everybody was affected by what was going on. And I'm just going to sort of conclude with a few sentences here. Martial in nature, the Texas Revolution is typically regarded as a male event. And yet, whether it was within the Texas Revolution, I'm really struggling with my views. Whether it was within the family or at the military strategy level, decisions being made by men deeply affected the families who took to the road to escape Santa Anna's forces. In some circumstances, these decisions meant life or death. Consequently, a number of women found their voice, using it to question the character, authority, or judgment of not only the men who opted out of service, who couldn't fight, but also the men leading the campaign. So, that's sort of just a little sense of some of the women's experiences during this Texas Revolution. There are many, many more. But those are examples of some brazenness. Thank you.